All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. We're diving into a critical piece of the pharmaceutical puzzle, the
hmm
ICH guidelines and that whole global harmonization thing.
Huge topic, yeah.
It's complex, right? But that's why you're here with us. You want to get up to speed and quickly on these really complicated topics.
Absolutely.
We're going to make it happen. Think of this deep dive as your shortcut, to understanding how these international agreements work, particularly one that you've probably heard of called ICH E6 R2.
Right.
It's basically the foundation for good clinical practice, or GCP, worldwide.
You got it. And what's really fascinating about this is that this whole system of global collaboration, it's really changed how new medicines are developed and regulated everywhere.
Yeah, for sure.
So we're going to unpack that, right? Like, why did these guidelines even come about in the first place? What's the big push for everyone doing things the same way? And what does it actually look like when you're running clinical trials across different countries, making sure everyone's on the same page?
Totally, totally. We also want to look at how these global recommendations, from ICH and so on, actually trickle down and end up influencing the specific laws and regulations that individual countries use. So no matter if you're deep in the pharmaceutical world, maybe you work in the industry, or you just want to know more about how your meds make it from the lab to your medicine cabinet, this should give you some good insights.
Definitely.
Okay, so first things first. What exactly is this ICH? What's the deal with that?
So ICH stands for the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use.
Catchy.
Right. Kind of a mouthful. It's this pretty unique organization that brings together both the regulatory agencies and the actual pharmaceutical industry. And they're from the big players like Europe, Japan, the
Wow.
United States.
Oh, so like the folks making the rules and the folks who got to follow them, all at the same table?
Yeah, exactly. And the main reason this whole thing exists, ICH, is to create a consistent set of standards, technical standards, for drug products. Before ICH, it was a mess. Picture this, right? You're a company and you want to launch this amazing new drug, let's say in the US, Europe, and Japan. You might have had to run basically the same tests 3 times in slightly different ways just to tick all the boxes for each region.
Oh my gosh.
It was super inefficient. It could really delay getting new treatments out to people who need them.
That sounds like a nightmare. So ICH basically stepped in and said, hey, can't we all just get along and maybe, find a way to do this more efficiently?
You got it. The big idea was, let's align these technical requirements.
Yeah.
Cut down on all that needless repetition, make drug development faster, and ultimately help people get new and innovative medicines quicker no matter where they live. And the fact that both regulators and industry folks from all these key areas are involved means the guidelines are both scientifically sound and actually doable in the real world.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Now, one thing we keep seeing pop up is this guideline, ICH E6R2. Why is that one so important?
Okay, so ICH E6, that's the main guideline defining good clinical practice, or as we all know it, GCP. It's like the rule book, the international standard for designing, conducting, recording, even reporting clinical trials that involve humans. Think of it as the gold standard for making sure those trial participants are protected, their rights, their safety, and their well-being are all top priority.
Right.
And that the data we get from those trials, that it's actually trustworthy and reliable.
Got it. So it's like the blueprint, from the very first idea for a study all the way to that final report.
Yeah, exactly. And ICH E6R2, that's the second update to this really crucial guideline. They're always refining things. The changes they made in R2, they really emphasize some critical stuff, like making absolutely sure that trial data is completely accurate and above board, and that any risks that come up during the study are managed proactively. Thinking about you always want to get that deep understanding. These are the core principles that ensure the medicines we end up using are safe and effective for everyone.
Yeah, data integrity and risk management. They all sound pretty essential when we're talking about, people's health.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Data integrity means that the data, the results from a clinical trial, they got to be accurate, complete, can't be missing anything, and they have to be reliable. Risk management, that's all about thinking ahead, looking for potential problems that could, mess with the quality of a trial or put participants at risk. And then you got to have plans in place to prevent those problems, or if they do happen, to minimize their impact. The update to R2, it really reflects just how much more complex clinical trials have become and how much more we understand now about how crucial these areas are.
So how do these ICH guidelines actually come about? I'm picturing like a bunch of scientists in a lab scribbling formulas on a whiteboard. Is it Anything like that?
Not quite, not quite. It's actually a very deliberate and collaborative process. You have these expert working groups made up of people from regulatory bodies in the pharmaceutical industry, and they're all from those ICH regions, Europe, Japan, US. They come together to figure out the best practices based on, the most recent scientific findings and ethical principles.
Ah, so it's like the best minds in the field all trying to find common ground.
You got it. That's a great way to put it. Once they've got a draft guideline, it goes out for public comment. So regulatory agencies and industry stakeholders, they get to look it over, give their feedback, make sure it makes sense in the real world, and that it addresses everyone's needs. The whole point is to reach a consensus, something all three regions can agree on and put into practice.
It's like a global conversation aiming for the best possible standards, right?
Exactly. And that consensus-driven approach, that's really a strong point of the ICH process. It means the guidelines are accepted pretty much everywhere, and they're actually used, not just sitting on a shelf somewhere.
Right, yeah. Okay, we've covered what ICH is. We've talked about how those guidelines get developed. Now let's zoom out a little bit. Why go through all this trouble to harmonize regulations on a global scale? What's the big payoff here?
The advantages, they're actually huge, and they touch so many aspects of this whole field. For one, it really streamlines drug development. Companies, they don't have to keep doing the same studies over and over again just because each country has a slightly different rule book.
Makes sense.
That saves time, that saves money, and it can get those new treatments out there faster. There are some estimates that say harmonization has helped reduce the amount of redundant testing by like 70% in some areas. That frees up a lot of resources for new innovative research.
Wow, 70%. That's massive.
It is. And then there's multinational clinical trials. Harmonization makes those way easier to run. When the standards for how you design a trial, how you run it, and how you report the data are more aligned across the board, companies can do one big trial across lots of countries all at once.
Right.
More seamless, less headache. And that means you can get way more patients involved from different backgrounds, and that leads to better data, more reliable results, and findings that apply to a wider range of people.
More patients, more data, and potentially faster answers about whether a treatment actually works.
You got it. And it also means that new medicines are more likely to get approved in different places around the same time, or at least closer together. If the trial data meets everyone's standards, then the review and approval process, it can happen in a more coordinated way. Ultimately, all of this boils down to one thing: patients getting access to those new and innovative treatments sooner.
So really, the big win is that it helps get needed medicines to people faster.
Exactly. Think of it like this. What if every country had totally different safety rules for airplanes?
Oh, okay.
Plane manufacturers would have to design and build all these different versions of the same plane, each one meeting some specific little requirement here and there. Super inefficient, super expensive. The same idea applies to developing new drugs. Harmonization cuts out all that duplication and lets everyone focus on those big breakthroughs and getting them to the people who need them most.
Got it. Okay, so ICH, they create these guidelines like ICH E6 or 2 that we talked about. But are these guidelines actually the law? Do countries have to follow them, like legally?
That's a really important point. ICH guidelines themselves, they're not technically legally binding like a law,
Okay.
but they have a lot of weight. They're usually adopted and put into practice by the regulatory agencies in those ICH regions, Europe, Japan, US. And we're seeing more and more countries around the world following suit.
So, for example, here in the U.S., the FDA, they would take those ICH guidelines and incorporate them into their own set of rules.
Exactly. That's a great example. You can see that connection when you look at regulations like the FDA's Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. We call it 21 CFR. Those core principles of good clinical practice from ICH E6R2, they show up in the FDA's rules about clinical trials, like in 21 CFR Part 312.
So even though ICH isn't like, a global police force or anything, their guidelines are a model that countries use to build their own legal systems for drug development.
That's a great way to think about it. It creates this baseline of standards, but it also gives those national authorities some wiggle room to adapt things to their own legal systems and context.
I bet this has some big implications for companies trying to run clinical trials across multiple countries. How does following ICH GCP, that E6R2 guideline, actually work in the real world for them?
Oh, it's crucial. When a company runs a clinical trial, according to ICH GCP, the data from that trial is much more likely to be accepted by those regulatory bodies in different countries. They don't have to keep repeating studies, which saves them tons of time and money.
It's like having this universally accepted language for clinical trial data, right?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yes. But even with harmonization, there can be little differences. ICH sets the big framework. But how those national agencies interpret and use those guidelines, it can vary a bit. There might also be some specific local rules that go beyond what ICH GCP covers.
Ah, so even with these international guidelines, you still need to be up to speed on the local rules and interpretations.
Exactly. ICH GCP, it's a great foundation, a strong one that's recognized pretty much everywhere. But to really run a successful multinational trial, you need to understand and comply with both those ICH guidelines and the specific rules of each country where you're working.
So it can get pretty tricky. How do pharmaceutical companies, especially those operating all over the world, how do they stay on top of all of this? What strategies do they use to make sure they're compliant?
Well, having really strong compliance strategies is essential, and there are a few key pieces to that puzzle. First, they need to have standardized operating procedures, or SOPs, for every single thing they do in a clinical trial.
Wow.
Those SOPs have to be documented meticulously, and they have to line up perfectly with the principles of GCP. We've talked about SOPs a lot in our past deep dives. They're the bedrock of both GMP and GCP compliance.
So we're talking SOPs for everything, like
Yeah.
how patients give informed consent, how you handle and report any side effects that pop up,
It's
everything.
everything. You got it. Second piece, comprehensive training programs for everyone involved in those trials.
All right.
Everyone, the doctors, the nurses running the trial at the sites, the study coordinators, data managers, everyone needs to be completely trained on those GCP requirements, their roles, and what they're responsible for. We've talked about the importance of thorough training a lot in the past, too.
Makes sense. Well-trained staff are way less likely to make mistakes that could put the whole trial at risk, right?
Absolutely. And then the third piece, they need strong data management and quality control systems to make sure that data stays accurate and reliable throughout the whole trial. That includes how it's collected, recorded, stored, and analyzed. We've talked about this before too. Keeping that clinical trial data clean and reliable, it's absolutely paramount.
And with everything moving to electronic systems, I'm guessing that also means making sure they're compliant with regulations like 21 CFR Part 11. We covered that in our deep dive on electronic records and signatures, remember?
Exactly right. And on top of all that, you need regular monitoring and auditing of those clinical trials to ensure everything's running smoothly and following the rules. This involves doing systematic checks to make sure the trial is sticking to the approved protocol, following those GCP guidelines, and in line with all the regulations. We've done some deep dives on GMP auditing, and it really highlighted how important these checks and balances are. And it all ties into what we learned from the FDA Clinical Investigator Training Course transcripts about how those regulatory inspections work.
So it's not just about avoiding problems, it's also about how you react and fix things when problems do come up.
Exactly. Being proactive and reactive. And remember, this whole regulatory landscape, it's constantly changing. ICH guidelines, they aren't set in stone.
Hmm.
They get updated to reflect new scientific discoveries, new technologies, and changes in how regulators think about things.
Got it.
The revisions to ICH E6, that's a perfect example of how things keep evolving.
Yeah, and with more and more reliance on digital tech in clinical trials, which we talked about with 21 CFR Part 11, the guidelines need to keep up with all those changes to make sure the
Yeah.
data is secure and reliable, even in the digital world.
Absolutely. Making sure electronic clinical trial data is secure, reliable, and trustworthy, that's a huge focus for both ICH guidelines and those national regulations.
Well, this has been a pretty enlightening journey into the world of ICH guidelines and this whole global harmonization effort in the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
It's clear that these aren't just abstract rules. They really impact how new medicines get developed and ultimately how they get to patients all over the world.
It's really a global effort, right? The big takeaways are that ICH guidelines, especially that ICH E6R2, they're the foundation for making sure clinical trials are done ethically and with high quality everywhere. They're the driving force behind harmonization. They have a huge influence on those national regulations. And in the end, they play a critical role in helping get those safe and effective medicines developed for everyone.
And for all of you listening, understanding all this, it gives you a lens to look at the world of pharmaceutical research and development. It's a complex world, often kind of hard to understand from the outside. But this shows you the global collaboration, the rigorous standards, all the things that go into making sure those medicines we all rely on are safe and effective.
It makes you think, right? As drug development becomes even more globalized and new tech like artificial intelligence and decentralized clinical trials become more common, how will those efforts to harmonize everything need to adapt? How do we keep things efficient and make sure we maintain the highest possible standards for patient safety and data integrity worldwide?
Really important questions to think about as the whole field keeps changing. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone.
Absolutely.
See you next time.